Well, to look at what has been an eventful week, ending with some very significant announcements, I'm joined now by three journalists. Catherine Lévesque is a reporter with La Presse Canadienne. Alex Boutilier is a national political reporter with the Toronto Star. And joining us from Toronto is Laura Stone. She's the Globe and Mail's reporter covering Ontario politics at Queen's Park. All three of you, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Okay, let's start with Catherine. I'll start with you in Ottawa watching this press conference. It was a substantial press conference today, a very long one, many ministers, a lot of content. Your reaction to the economic aid? We saw the successor to the rent subsidy, a relatively unsuccessful program that expired last September, at the end of September. We saw its successor announced today. What do you make of it?
One word, finally. The main criticism, I would say, of that program is the fact that all this money was going to the landlords and not to the businesses directly who desperately needed that money. So what we would see was landlords not wanting to go to this program and use it, or we would see criteria that was way too difficult to attain for businesses who would want to reopen and everything. They had to not get any 70% of their revenues for 3 months. So that, really it wasn't used enough. So what the government did today was actually a step in the right direction, is that it just enlarged the program and the money will be going directly to the businesses who desperately need the money. So I think it's a good step in the right direction. And of course, all this information, right, is coming, on the beginning of a long weekend. And it was a very long press conference indeed, almost 2 hours.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things, though, too, is one could suggest that maybe the Prime Minister was thinking that this will give people to talk about, comforting news, if you will, new programs to talk about over Thanksgiving dinners or whatever. Laura, you've been in Toronto. It's been a really eventful week as well. You and your colleagues were grilling the Premier, Doug Ford, all week long about when the measures that he announced today were finally going to come, with the figures, the COVID-19 numbers going up and up and up. What's it been like, and how difficult has it been for the Premier?
Well, this has been a real roller coaster of emotions in Ontario this week, Martin. I mean, we had the Premier earlier this week defending restaurants and bars, saying there's only a few bad apples in Toronto who are the cause of outbreaks, and he wouldn't be closing down indoor dining despite the calls from Toronto's medical officer of health to do so. Cut to today, where his government and his cabinet approved widespread measures in Toronto, Ottawa, and Peel region, just west of the city. Everything from indoor dining to casinos to gyms to limiting gatherings. Weddings are going to be limited now. It's a really widespread set of restrictions and closures. And you saw a very rattled Premier Ford at his press conference today. He looked like he really didn't want to do this, but he'd seen numbers from the top doctors and numbers and hospitalizations that clearly spooked him. The big question for the Premier, though, is why he didn't do this earlier if the modeling had predicted exactly what we're seeing now, which is upwards of 900 to 1,000 cases predicted by the middle of October.
Yeah, because it's interesting, because as you say, earlier this week, he was adamantly saying, show me the data, show me the data. And that was at the beginning of the week. And obviously in that famous meeting and the briefing yesterday and today with the minister and his public health officials, they showed him the data. Catherine, I want to segue to you, because obviously you pay a lot of attention to the Quebec Premier. I mean, Quebec has, yesterday extended further. I mean, the huge swath of the province is now in this red alert zone with very, very stringent measures. We have a situation in Quebec where tracking is not working. Montreal has given up on a lot of the tracking. They're asking people to phone their own contacts if they test positive. But we also saw reports of Quebec, or especially Montreal, health officials rebutting federal StatsCan officials who've been freed up to help the Quebec. How are things going in Quebec? It doesn't sound as if things are going very smoothly there.
No, I think things are difficult in Ontario, but also in Quebec. And yes, surprising news this week, because I remember clearly Prime Minister Justin Trudeau telling, I think it was in May or in June, but telling the provinces, look, we have people to help you. We have employees from Statistic Canada. They can help do the contact tracing. Just ask us and we will give you these thousands of people. Obviously, Quebec did not use them. And now they're stuck in a situation where there were some news reports this week saying that they only used a few hundred of those employees, of those federal employees, and now we're stuck in the situation where simply Montreal can't keep up and the whole province cannot keep up. And people are just starting to use this, the COVID alert app. So we're in a difficult situation in Quebec, and I think that has to do with the provincial government saying, having this attitude of, well, we can just manage by ourselves and we can do all of this contact tracing by our own means. Obviously, they cannot keep up, so they kind of have to take us a step forward actually today, and they have to admit that they did it all wrong. They did not see this big wave coming, and now they're stuck scrambling and telling everyone to download the COVID Alert app, but also to contact everyone and to ask Ottawa to help them out on this point where they already had the help actually.
Okay, Alex, I want to ask you, what are you watching for? Because, I mean, there's so much in this issue. Every week we end up talking about really the only one issue, and that is the government's response to COVID-19. What are you watching for next week, as Parliament's off next week, but over the next coming days and weeks?
Yeah, there's an interesting question to the Prime Minister today at his press conference, and it was about when the feds will step in with more sort of extreme measures, or if they would consider that. Remember, we talked in the spring about the potential of the Emergency Measures Act, the feds actually telling the provinces what to do. The Prime Minister definitely doesn't want to go there, but with cases spiking, up to the thousands per day in Ontario and Quebec, I think it's fair for Canadians to ask, what has to be done in those two provinces to get this under control.
What about, I'm going to throw this out there. I was doing some math and number crunching last night when I saw the numbers out of Alberta. I mean, there are other hot spots as well. We saw, a surprising outbreak in New Brunswick, but we saw Alberta. When you do the adjusting for population, Alberta's figures last night were stunning, and yet they've only announced voluntary measures. Any thoughts, anyone, on that?
Well,
Yeah,
I think we're seeing go ahead, Alex.
Go ahead, Alex, and then Laura.
I think you saw a bit of that in the press conference today with Deputy Prime Minister Freeland saying they have to move to more targeted measures in the second wave because, as we saw today with Toronto, Ottawa, and the Peel region being shut down or further restrictions being put on them, that's very different than, a restaurant in Halifax or a yoga studio in Vancouver. So I think the second wave's challenge is going to be addressing those regional issues from a national perspective, because ultimately, if cases remain high in Toronto, cases remain high in Montreal, that's trouble for everybody, no matter where you're at.
Okay, Laura, go ahead.
I think there's a lot of public fatigue, too. We've heard here in Ontario, especially problems not understanding the different rules or not quite thinking that they're making a lot of sense. And people having a lot more contacts now than they did back in the second wave, where they maybe had 5 to 10 people who they associated with. Now we're hearing from officials it's up to 50, 75, 100. Kids are back in school and they're seeing their friends again. We know that the government has really hesitated to close them, and they don't want kids to be back at home without being in class and learning and having that peer support. So I think the biggest challenge for governments now is keeping the public on side. I think people have a lot more questions. They're a lot more skeptical of government measures now than they would have been back in the first wave.
Yeah, I think we can all identify with the comment on fatigue and pandemic fatigue, and yet we are still right in the midst of it. I want to thank all three of you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.